Welcome to the shop, my friend. Steve here at SKS Props, and in today's video I've got something that I've wanted to build for quite some time. Now, those of you that follow me know that I absolutely love Warhammer 40K. I love the aesthetic of it, the lore, the minis, and the props. And that's where today's video comes into play. The sponsor for today's video is Newverse, and they're the developers of Warhammer 40,000 Lost Crusade. With the new updates, you can now join one of 4 available Space Marine chapters in the game, and what's really cool is that each chapter has its own different buff, basic design, and chapter skills. You can also go to lostcrusade.com and join the Rally Your Chapter for the Imperium event, which will allow you to invite friends for even more chances for rewards. In my comments section, I'll have a link that you can go check out, plus I've got a code where you can claim $10 worth of in-game rewards. The 4 chapters that you have to choose from are, of course, the Ultramarines, the Raven Guard, White Scars, and the Imperial Fists. 2 of my biggest things to really take away from this is if you're a fan of the Warhammer 40,000 miniatures, I really think you're going to enjoy all the 3D models and all the little Easter eggs that they've put into this game. And for a mobile game, I'm really impressed with the voice acting for these characters.
Our deeds will echo those of the chapter's greatest heroes.
The absence of faith is the mark of the heretic.
So with the mobile game Warhammer 40,000 Lost Crusade, the developers asked me, would you like to build something from the Warhammer universe to help us promote the game? And I was like, of course I will. So I built an Absolver bolt pistol. Now the great thing about this particular pistol is, regardless of its giant size and scale, it's made completely out of my HD foam, so it's actually pretty light and it's con safe. So I want to show you what it takes to put this bolt pistol together and paint it, so let's go ahead and get started. Taking the pattern that I created in Photoshop, I'm going to cut away the lower and upper angles as well as the barrels on the front. This will give me the main body of the pistol, and I'm going to transfer this onto some 10mm HD foam with a pencil. After I have a rough cut of the outline, I'm going to transfer this shape onto the foam 2 more times. That will give me 3 total pieces. To make sure that this has some stability, I'm going to add a metal rod through the handle and through the main body. The rod is positioned in the handle, and then I mark with a permanent marker exactly where I want the bend to be. After all the bends have been made, I can trace around this piece to give me an outline of exactly where the groove needs to be cut. To create the channel, I'm going to use a small stone bit in the end of my Dremel rotary tool. A little Bob Smith superglue is added to the channel, and the rod can now be pressed into place. To glue the first 2 pieces together, I'm going to be using some Weldwood contact cement. I'll then follow that up with my double adhesive method by adding a small bit of superglue all along the perimeter of the first cut. After the contact cement is dried, I can then firmly press the 2 halves together, also using a PVC pipe as a roller. This will make sure these 2 pieces are firmly adhered together, and now I can trim away any additional foam. I can now repeat this process onto the 3rd piece of the 10mm foam. And with all 3 pieces of foam glued together, you can see that this gives us a good width, but that metal rod on the inside is going to make sure it's nice and stable. Going back to my template, I'm now going to cut off the angled section of the lower barrel and the handle. Go ahead and transfer your template onto some 6mm foam 2 times and cut it out. Once again, using my double adhesive method, these 2 6mm pieces can now be adhered to the main body of the pistol. Now, just like when you were sandwiching the other layers, you could have some additional foam sticking out, so feel free to cut it flush at this time. Notice on the bottom there are 2 sections that stick past the body. This is where the magazine will go later on. To trim out the trigger, I'm going to be using a Forstner bit and drilling all the way through the foam. Now, if you don't have a Forstner bit, it's no problem. You can still do this process with a hobby knife. And that's because either way, we're going to clean up this section with a smooth sanding drum on my Dremel rotary tool. I also take this opportunity to round over the sharp edges on the handle. Following the outline of the enclosure on the lower barrel, I cut that away from the top. I then reattach the angled section that I'd cut off earlier. After cutting away the paper for all the individual slots, I then transfer this onto some 10mm foam, as well as leaving a strip for the lower section that will make up the angle. Using my bandsaw, I cut lines for all the individual slots, as well as a line across the top of this barrel piece. I then changed the angle of the table to 30 degrees and cut that all along the bottom of this piece. This 30-degree angle is also applied to either side of this 3/4 inch strip. I can now trim away the foam from these individual sections with a hobby knife, and I smooth out the round section at the top with my sanding drum. I then take my angled strip, cut it to match, and then glue those onto each individual section. And you can see now how this will wrap around the bottom of the pistol. Because I have multiple layers of stacked foam on the bottom that will be exposed, I'm going to take a strip of 2mm foam and glue that over it to hide all those seams. With a 2mm strip in place, I can now measure out the width in between these two halves, which turns out to be 1 inch. I once again mark out each individual section on this 1 inch strip, and then I cut these pieces out and I glue them on one at a time. So you can see by having the two 30-degree angle cuts and then the flat cut along the bottom, it allows this section to wrap around the bottom of the pistol just right. This lower section for the pistol can now be glued into place with some super glue. For this next template, check out the video. I'm going to tape part of the upper section to the magazine. This template is transferred onto some 4mm foam, and it's going to allow the top of this pistol to pop out just a little bit. It's going to glue right on top of the magazine port and across the face of the pistol, making sure to still leave that gap for the vents at the top. You can now take your template for the upper part of the bolter and transfer that onto some 10mm foam, as well as having that 3/4 inch strip. Just like before, the top of this bolter section as well as the 3/4 inch strip are both going to be cut at 30-degree angles. After that, the table can now be set to 0 again and the upper piece can be cut out. I lightly mark with a pencil on the side of the pistol exactly where this piece is going to go before I start gluing all the individual angled sections to the top. Just like the bottom, you can see how those angled sections give us the perfect curve to the top of the piece. I can now measure for the strip that's going to run along the top, which is going to be 1.5 inches. These sections are cut out, glued on, and these two halves can now be joined together. Just like the bottom, this section would have been exposed, showing all those individual seams. So I'm going to take another strip of 2mm foam and glue it over this area to make it seamless. And as another detail, I add an additional strip of 2mm foam along the bottom. The upper section of the pistol can now be fit on top, and once I determined everything looks fine, it is glued into place. For the upper barrel, I'm going to be using a 2-inch PVC pipe, but I'm also going to wrap it with some 2mm foam. This is going to bulk it out a little bit, but also give me a better surface for the paint to adhere to. To create the vent ports on either side, I use a hole saw attached to my drill. I cut a small simple template out of some 2mm foam to cover all the seams on the front before I glue on the barrel. I then take a slightly smaller PVC pipe and glue that to the middle to act as the barrel. For the lower barrel, I take a small 1¼ inch coupler and add a strip of 2mm foam to the bottom to detail it out. Once again, we've got some ugly seams here in the front, so I cut a small simple template out of some 6mm foam and glue that to the front of the pistol. To create the port for the magazine, I start by gluing a small 10mm block to the back. Then I take 3 strips of the 10mm foam and a 4mm ledge to create the actual magazine. To hide my seams at the back of the pistol, I'm once again going to use a strip of 2mm foam. This is going to be adhered down with some super glue and just wrap around the back of the piece. I use a hole punch to create some of the circles that I'm going to need for the details on the side. To create the larger circles, I break out my circle jig that I have for my bandsaw. I cut out 2 different diameters and I glue both of those in place to match my template. The other 2 details are just some small strips cut out of 6mm foam. For the skull and the wings, I start by tracing their approximate location. The wings themselves are transferred onto some 4mm foam, and I lightly score the lines for each individual segment. After the wing has been cut out, I can then lightly use a heat gun to open up all those lines for a crisp detail. The upper part of the wing is hand cut out of some 6mm foam, and you can see how these 2 sizes side by side give it a nice tiered effect. Each piece can now be glued to the side of the pistol, referencing the lines that I had drawn on earlier. The skull for the side of the pistol was transferred onto some 10mm foam, cut out by hand and then rounded over with my Dremel rotary tool. Using a small stone bit, I was able to carve away some of the details for the eyes and the teeth. I then switched over to my heat tool, which allowed me to get crisper details, switching out the tool tips. Now remember, when heating foam, always wear your respirator. The skulls can now be glued on either side of the pistol. Next, I glued down some faux rivets matching my template design. For the magazine release switch, I glued together a small strip of 2mm and 4mm foam. For the sights at the top of the pistol, a couple of pieces of 4mm foam were angled on my bandsaw and then glued into place. For the guard beneath the handle, I started by gluing together 2 pieces of 10mm foam. This should give me a decent thickness and will be cut slightly wider than the handle itself. I angle cut the top of this block on my bandsaw just for an additional detail and then cut away the sides. You see these 2 holes at the bottom, and that's because I added some additional rods into the handle. This helped give the handle a little bit more stability, but it also pinned the guard to the bottom. For the 2 ribs that wrap around the handle, I'm going to be using some 15mm HD foam half-round dowels. The dowels were cut at a slight angle on either end and then glued into place. The trigger was traced and cut out as some 10mm foam and glued into the guard. The smaller skull for the front was traced onto some stacked 10mm foam. Just like the skulls on the side, it was refined using my rotary tool and the heat tool. Now it needs to look as though it's attached as a charm to the front of the pistol, and to do that I'm going to be using some 10mm HD foam round dowels. These are glued to either side of a small wedge that I cut out and then glued directly to the sides of the skull. Now it's a little too clean, so for some battle damage I used the side of a stone cylinder to give it some small nicks. Also, to replicate the metal corroding or being distorted, I used the tinfoil technique. This is where I slightly heat up the foam with a heat gun and then press the foil in to emboss it. With fabrication complete, I can now seal and paint this piece, and to start I'm going to be adding a couple of thin layers of Plasti Dip. After the Plasti Dip had cured, I can now switch over to some Rust-Oleum hammered metal. This is applied to the lower half of the gun, the handle, and the barrels. Krylon red oxide primer can now be sprayed onto the top half of the pistol. The entire pistol will now receive a wash of Liquitex Mars Black. For this process, I'm going to be using a mop brush and a ton of water. The main trick here is that the pigment gets down into all the different details that I'd put into the foam. After the entire pistol had been covered, I then go back in with a wet paper towel and mop up a lot of the excess. While waiting for parts of it to dry, I can now paint the entire handle completely black. And I go back in with a dry mop brush to stipple the surface to give it an additional texture. Going back with a smaller filbert brush, I can now start to outline and fill in some of the detailed areas with additional Mars Black. This is a lot more strategic process than what I'd laid down with the mop brush. And just like before, any additional paint can be easily cleaned up with a damp paper towel. I also take this opportunity to add paint to the angled cuts at the top and the skull and the wings that are on the sides. For the main body of this pistol, I'm going to be hand painting on some cadmium-free red medium. Now this is an extremely opaque paint, and I don't add any water to it because I don't want it running down into the recesses. This is completely a dry brushing process. To give this surface a variance and not have it all be the same color, I go back with additional paint in certain areas as a highlight. Now I'm going to add some Liquitex Iridescent Rich Silver for the metallic sections. This is going to be applied over the silver sections of the gun, still allowing some of the additional grime that we had put down to show through. This will give the surface kind of an oiled, weathered, greasy look. For pieces like the skulls, the silver is dry brushed onto the surface. This multi-layered process will give it a more believable but yet grungy look. But I want some additional variances in those colors, so I go back in with some Mars Black in the recesses. This is going to set up a shadowed area in the wings and make this a little more prominent in the end. For an additional highlight, I go back in with the silver on the tips of the wings and feather that into the middle. This is also where I take the time to paint the heads of all the fake rivets. Now since I'm going with a heavy wear on this pistol, I really want it to have a chip paint look, and to achieve that I'm going to be using more of the iridescent rich silver. Now if you notice, the paint is pretty thick and I'm using the side of my brush to tap it onto the surface. This will obscure that red that's underneath and give it the impression that it's chipped away. Now just like some of the other detailed techniques, you could overdo this. So you want to pick areas that looks like that's where the paint would chip. Because when you're building a prop, from the beginning to the paint, you want to be telling a story. And the story of this particular piece is that it's been through a lot. I also do the same paint chip technique along the edges of the metal as well. Here though, instead of looking like it's chipped away, it's more like it's taken the grunge and ripped it off, exposing the new bright metal underneath. And in the end, to make them really pop, I decided to do a final highlight on the wings and the skulls. So you all can see the steps that I took to put together my Warhammer 40K Absolver bolt pistol. Now the great thing about this build is that you don't have to build this particular weapon. You can utilize these tips and techniques to build a multitude of different weapons from the Warhammer universe or your own. So hopefully you're enjoying these videos. If you are, give them a thumbs up, share them with your friends and family, and remember to check out Warhammer 40,000 Lost Crusade.